All right, good evening to the grand crowds gathered here tonight, North Branch Nature Center. It's a pleasure to see you all. My name is Sean. If I haven't met you before, I'm the program director here at North Branch and coordinate the Naturalist Journeys series. So thanks for coming to the exciting conclusion of this 6-part adventure we've been on throughout the winter here, looking this year at Vermont's forests, and particularly looking at how we create healthy and sustainable forests, looking at that word healthy in all sorts of ways, sustainable in all sorts of ways, and forests in all sorts of ways as well, and hearing from different folks who work in the profession of thinking about how to take care of our forests. So if you haven't seen previous talks in our series, I invite you to go to our presentations page, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations, where all of the recordings of all of our Naturalist Journeys talks and pretty much everything else we do that's in like a presentation format is recorded and there for you. Also, hello to everybody watching on the live stream as well. So I don't forget to mention it, you can put questions in the chat on the live stream, in like the YouTube chat, and at the end I'll moderate those questions to Caitlin, so I'll be keeping an eye on those. And since we're on the topic of questions, we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A after the talk, so hold your questions till the end if you don't mind, and yeah, we'll have a nice Q&A after. So I want to thank everybody for your support of North Branch Nature Center. So your support makes things like Naturalist Journeys possible. So for those of you that are members, thank you. For those of you that gave and donated in your registration tickets, thanks for that. If you would like to show your support for the Nature Center tonight, Anna Maria and I can help you figure out ways to do that after the talk. So please continue to support North Branch. I want to say thanks to our sponsors that make this possible to be free for everybody. So our lead sponsors, Hunger Mountain Co-op and 802 Coffee, as well as the other sponsors you can see up here on the screen. And I also want to say a big shout out to Orca Media, who's been recording these talks and live streaming them this whole winter. And that has been huge, especially as people get continually buried deeper and deeper in snow out there. It's nice to know that folks are able to watch online as well. Yeah, so we've been hearing from folks like Shelby Perry with Northeast Wilderness Trust talking about what happens when you can let forests do their own thing and kind of regain their own autonomy. We've heard from folks like Ethan Tapper learning about where the intersection is between, a chainsaw and love and compassion is. And we've been hearing from folks like Steve Hagenbu at Audubon, Vermont about, what does a bird care about when it looks at a forest? And so we're going to continue on this theme of learning from some great professionals in the field. And so please help me welcome Caitlin Cusack from Vermont Land Trust to learn about her work.
Great, thanks Sean. Can everyone hear me okay with this? Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming everyone. Thanks for digging out and bearing the cold to join us here tonight, and for all those joining online. I hope you're comfortable sipping tea in your chairs as well. So has anyone attended all of the 6 series here? Has anyone? Oh, Sean, yes, congratulations, great. Well, it's been a great series. I encourage you, if you haven't listened to the other ones yet, check them out. There's been some really great sort of thoughts and information shared. So where are we headed tonight? So I'll start with who the heck am I? And then I'll give kind of a brief overview of some of the conservation tools we have at our disposal to keep forests as forests, to protect land from development. But where I'm going to spend the majority of my time is looking at these 2 case studies of properties that the Land Trust actually owns, where we're using ecological management to address certain threats, and that we're using it to achieve a number of different goals. And so since Ethan kicked us off, the words on my screen are way too small for me to read, so I'm going to turn and read from here. He kicked us off, and so I love this quote from his book, How to Love a Forest. And that is, "I'm learning to accept that this world demands more from me, that I have no choice but to be a beaver, a passenger pigeon, a pileated woodpecker, to become a keystone species, singing the music of change. I search for a relationship with this forest that is both pragmatic and kind, tempered with both humility and responsibility. I'm gonna put that back there. So I offer this for our consideration tonight, and that's that we have tools to protect land from development, but there are many cases where that may not be enough. And that is because some of the issues and threats that I'll talk about throughout this talk, and that some of our other speakers have talked about, and that oftentimes ecological management can help us sort of address those. So, kind of start with, who am I? So I was raised in eastern Massachusetts, and it's a kind of a suburban town just outside of Boston. And I'll have to say, I hadn't the slightest idea what a tedder or a manure spreader was at that time. I didn't know how you would take a log and make it into a board, sap into syrup, or that somebody could actually solely heat with wood. And so there were kind of different experiences sort of in my life that kind of led me to appreciate the more intricate connection we can have with land. And that was working on an organic farm when I was in high school, and then traveling, as you see the picture of me with one of those big redwoods, spending about 5 months on the west coast of Vancouver Island, to really start to appreciate that intricate relationship, but also our dependence on the land for food, for heat, for fiber, for building materials, for clean water, for clean air, all these things that we know and sort of appreciate. So after I spent an AmeriCorps visitor term in southeastern Ohio working with American ginseng growers, I like to say I came to my senses and went back to school and got a degree in forestry. But that was at 27, so a little bit later, and I landed in Vermont in 2008. And that's sort of over the last 10 years, I've worked as a forester with the Vermont Land Trust. So I'll talk a little bit more about that organization in a minute for those that aren't familiar. And so I live in Bristol with my husband and my daughter Fiona, who you see her here. She's 6 now, but we have a sugaring business, Little Hogback Farm. We are bird friendly, mind you. So I know Steve spoke about sort of benefits of birds. And so, you know, I'm hoping to raise Fiona so she knows at a younger age how you may turn sap into syrup at least, right? So for those, are folks familiar with the Vermont Land Trust? Is that an organization folks are familiar with? Yeah, great, okay. So for those that may be new, we're a statewide conservation organization. We have a number of amazing land trusts in this state, from Stowe Land Trust up north, South Hero Land Trust, Upper Valley Land Trust. We are a statewide land trust that since 1977 has worked with local and state partners to conserve over 640,000 acres of land in Vermont. We will soon celebrate our 50th anniversary, which is pretty exciting. And VLT also owns, so that's our acronym VLT, we also own land. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So I mentioned, you know, we have some conservation tools that protect land from development. These are tools that keep forests as forests. And I know there's been a lot of attention probably in the news and kind of around about forest carbon. Well, these are tools that actually also protect land from development. So we have a couple of those. One is anyone enrolled or familiar with the Family Forest Carbon Program? Yeah, great. Familiar with it, great. Yeah, so this is a program, it's a 20-year commitment. It's run by the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. And land is protected from development, and a landowner is paid for the additional carbon that they sequester and store in their forests through improved forest management. So 20-year contract or commitment. We also have carbon markets, so there's voluntary and compliance. These commitments sort of range in terms of the tenure of their agreement. They can be 25 years up to 100 years, right? And so that's where the land is protected from development and the landowner is paid for any additional carbon that they sequester and store. And those carbon credits are sold to either in the compliance market to a polluter that's regulated that will buy these carbon offsets in order, they either have to reduce their emissions or they have to buy offsets, right? And then in the voluntary market, these would be folks like UVM who wants to reduce their carbon footprint. So these landowners can sell these carbon credits on the market. So again, land is protected for development for the duration of that contract. And then current use. Are folks familiar with the use value appraisal program? Any folks have land enrolled in current use here? Okay, yep, Paul, yep, great. So this is, again, another tool that we have where the landowner agrees not to develop their land. So a lien is placed on the land by the state. And then the landowner agrees to, if it's enrolled in the forest category and the land is eligible, they agree to manage their land for a range of forest values. And that is, the agreement is sort of stays in place for sort of the duration of that time. There is, if a landowner wants to end the agreement, they can pay a land use change tax. Oftentimes that value is a significant disincentive, but it is an option, right? So this is not, what I've talked about right now are not permanent conservation, but they are sort of tools we have. And then there's folks maybe familiar with municipal zoning, right? Zoning definitely can limit the number of houses in certain parts of town. So it's, again, another tool. But where we've gotten to now is sort of what I consider the Cadillac of conservation tools, which is the conservation easement. This is really the only tool we have that permanently protects land from development. Are folks familiar with conservation easements, or folks have easements on their property? Great, I'm seeing a bunch of nods. So I'll go over this kind of quickly, but basically how a conservation easement looks. I mean, typically I've heard of land rights are kind of like a bundle of sticks, or my previous coworker, the late Carl Powden, said it's like a bundle of pens, and he would hold up sort of a bundle of pens for you to think about. And each of those pens represents a right that a landowner has. A landowner has a right to build a house, to build barns, to farm, to harvest firewood, sort of all of those rights. And in a conservation easement, there's agreement where that landowner gives up the right to further develop their land. And those rights then, those development rights, are held by a qualifying organization like a land trust, like the Vermont Land Trust. And so that's kind of the agreement. And they are in perpetuity forever, right? So those are just some of the conservation tools that we have at our disposal that has led to sort of protection of land. But as I said, I want us to consider that those tools really, especially when we think of the Cadillac, conservation easements, those protect land from development. But there are a lot of other things and factors that affect sort of the forests that we see today. And a lot of those factors I'll sort of go around and give sort of examples of those. So past land use. Some of our previous speakers have, kind of named that back in the mid to late 1800s, 75% of the state was open land. We're now in the opposite level, where 75% of our state is forested now. But can you imagine sort of when it was mostly open land? And so the forests we see today are not pre-settlement forests. These are forests that have responded in, I think Shelby Perry said, the Great Recovery or something like that. I love that, sort of naming that resilience of our forests to come back after that disturbance. So that really dictates, what we see our forests sort of look like today. And then we think of past management decisions. We make the best maple syrup, obviously, but you'll see a lot of sugar bushes that are just sugar maple, and that's because over time we've selectively chosen those species and trees sort of to benefit. And so that can go both ways. In this case, sort of a maple monoculture may not be the best place to be, right? There is, as they say, strength in diversity, right? So that's kind of something we have to think about when we're looking at our forests of today. We have introduced weed species, barberry, honeysuckle. I know folks are probably familiar with these species, and those are really causing significant impacts of our use of enjoyment if you're trying to walk down a path with barberry or knotweed sort of coming at you. But also it really impacts the ability of our native vegetation to become established. It really can crowd out a lot of those species that we prefer and those species that support a lot of insects, right, that are the sort of base of our food web. And then you think of introduced pests like the emerald ash borer, right? The emerald ash borer threatens the existence of all species of ash native to North America, including the 3 species here. Excuse me. And then Jess talked a lot about climate change and sort of what are we going to see with sort of these changes ahead and how's that going to impact things. And then there's like, we demand so much from our forests, right? We want firewood and all that. So, you know, just to say that here's kind of the suite of things that are sort of impact. So this is kind of the doom and gloom kind of the kind of depressing part. We'll get to more positive ways that we can be involved to take action, I promise. But this is kind of sort of, when I say conservation easements aren't enough, it's because here's the other things that are happening with our forest. So this map shows the darker shades of green are all the lands that have been protected in Vermont with conservation easements that the Vermont Land Trust holds. There is many more conserved lands, there are many more conserved lands in the state. So this is not completely a representative of all the conservation land, but I just wanted to show you this because the green circles indicate the land that the Land Trust owns. And we own about 5,000 acres that we hold to really be like learning laboratories or classrooms where we can apply best practices and then share them with others. And so that's kind of one of the goals of sharing some of the work we've done in these lands, to share and have a discussion about, you know, how as a community, what are some of the tools that we have at our disposal. So, you know, on these lands, we've really used ecologically focused management practices in order to improve the ability of our forests to respond to climate change and stressors, to protect clean drinking water, sequester and store carbon, enhance wildlife habitat. Think of what Steve had talked about with forestry for the birds. How do we manage for breeding bird habitat? Restoring old forest characteristics, supporting local forest businesses, and then meeting some of our needs. So thinking about our heating and building needs in this sort of changing world. So the first place, you know, I want to start is the Jerusalem Skyline property. So this is, so I'll kind of go back here. The two properties that I'll talk about are Jerusalem Skyline, which is there. It's located in Starksboro, and then the Button Farm is the other one that is in Colchester, Vermont. And so we'll talk about how these goals can be met through ecological management. And you know, one thing to think about is if we don't sort of act, what's at risk? Well, we can impact the ability of the forest to regenerate, or kind of the ability of that next generation of trees to establish. We can impact our use and enjoyment, and our ability to continue to provide saw timber, firewood, that sort of thing. So those are sort of the things at stake if we don't address some of these sort of issues that we've talked about. So this is Jerusalem Skyline. So if folks are familiar with South Starksboro, this is for those of you, I know my friend in the back has hiked the Long Trail. This is my favorite section of the Long Trail. So this is called the Monroe Skyline. So the Land Trust property looks, if you're standing on the edge of our woods and you're looking out, you're looking at this skyline. And this is the section of the Long Trail that goes from Lincoln Gap to Appalachian Gap. And so this property was donated to the Vermont Land Trust in 1986 by Elizabeth Hill and Constance Robert. And here's a kind of little landscape view of that same area. So our property is in the sort of the yellow, the little piece there. Let's see, I'm going to talk louder and step away for all you in the room. But here is Starksboro. We've got Lincoln here and Bristol. So for those that are familiar with this area, this is the Hogback Mountain. And then on the other side, this is that Monroe Skyline I was talking about. So this is kind of the spine of the greens. And so one of the tools we use to prioritize and figure out how we can strategically conserve land is Vermont conservation design. And this is really, I consider it like a statewide vision and guide for how we can protect and enhance ecological function into the future. So there are many different levels and many different factors that Vermont conservation design considers. What I wanted to share here with you is this interior forest block consideration. And interior forest block meaning The green is the highest priority interior forest blocks, and those are areas that have very few fragmenting features. And what do I mean by fragmenting features? Roads, agricultural land, residential use, things that kind of break up habitat that can have impacts on that. And so these are areas that are core habitat for a lot of species, wildlife species, right? And so you'll see our little property, we're not in a high priority interior forest block, but we're in what they consider to be a connectivity block. And so these blocks, as you can see, it's a critical linkage between those two interior forest blocks. So there are maybe some more fragmenting features like roads and agricultural land and residential development than you would find in the interior forest block. But it's certainly much less than you would find sort of in village centers or valleys in that area. So it's still serving an important ecological function. And that's for sort of wide-ranging animals to move between these two higher priority forest blocks, for the movement of plants and spread of sharing of genetic material. These are important sort of connections. So this just gives you a sense of, when we think about how do different properties fit within the big picture, this is kind of how this property fits into that bigger picture. So if we zoom in a little bit, we will see, so again, our southern boundary there at the bottom, that's the town of Lincoln. And you'll see on our northern boundary, there's that field edge. And so when we, and then the brown lines, which I'm realizing now on the screen are a little hard to see, but trust me, there's some very steep slopes on this property. And where they occur is sort of right in this area, right? This is a ridge that kind of extends, and I'm going to show you a picture of this in a couple slides, but this is a ridge, pretty steep slopes that are really hard to operate on, so they kind of are serving a little bit as reserves because it's just really hard to manage on them and have been. And so foresters divide, sort of when we think of properties, we kind of delineate what we call stands. And a stand is sort of a management unit that may have similar species composition compared to other areas of the property. It may have similar age. It may have a similar management history. And so we have two stands on this property, and you'll see stand one is in the northern edge. It's a little hard. This is the stand boundary here, and here's stand one. And you'll see it's right on the edge of that field. And based on just some of the tree cores and kind of thinking of the history and some presence of stone walls and some of these open grown old maples, it's thought that particularly along the field edge, probably was pasture and reverted from pasture about 70 to 90 years ago. The rest of the property, there were probably some areas that might never have been cleared, but certainly there was, kind of use of the property for pasture, but certainly a lot of sugar maple on the property, so with evidence of sugaring as well, kind of throughout its history. So I just wanted to kind of share that as kind of the history kind of this place. And to say, back to our consideration for the evening, this property is protected from development. But when we looked at sort of different assessments, we identified some vulnerabilities and some issues that we then were able to address or are addressing sort of using some ecological management tools. So, for those of you, so did anyone hear has anyone heard Steve Hagenbuch talk about forestry for the birds and bird habitat? Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. Okay, so so I should back up just for a second. This property has been enrolled in current use since 1988. So it's been under the guidance, the management's been under the guidance of a forest management plan since then. And for current use, you have to update your plan every 10 years. So in 2018, or looking towards 2018, was another one of our management plan updates. So I had a couple of assessments done that have helped guide our management going forward. And one was to invite Steve, who's a conservation biologist and forester from Audubon, Vermont, to come out and do a forest bird habitat assessment. Okay? So for those of you that are aware of this, in looking at this forest, when you think about forest bird habitat features, what seems to be missing? Understory, yes, awesome, great, thank you, perfect. So understory, and the understory is really sort of 0 to 5 feet off the ground. And why is the understory, what's the understory important for?
Nesting habitat, food. For birds. Well,
Perfect.
other species as well.
Perfect, awesome. Okay, so one of our participants here, nesting habitat and food and cover for bird species. So that's definitely something that Steve identified as missing in this. And it makes sense. I mean, the last time we did any forest management on this property was 1994. So that was about, over 25 years ago. And the canopy had kind of closed in. And so we have this, situation where we don't have a lot of woody vegetation in the understory. There's not a lot of light reaching the understory. Any other components that you can think of that might be missing? A little harder to...
Older trees.
Yeah, older trees,
That's
great.
pretty young, a lot of saplings or small trees there.
Yeah, yep, so older trees. We do have some on this, you'll get to see them. We do have some, not in this photo, but yes, no, you'll get to see some. Yeah, anything else? What would we think would be? Think of like woodpeckers, pileated woodpeckers. Yeah, awesome. So snags, so standing dead trees, and then down wood on the forest floor, right? Those are things we're missing. And so here's a little fun test of our bird species. This beautiful blue bird in the middle. Folks know what that is. Oh. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so the black-throated blue warbler. Why would I put that one in this photo? Folks know where that likes to nest?
Evergreens?
Oh, sure. I think there is an association with softwoods. Yeah, yeah. But they nest pretty close to the ground. They nest in that understory layer. So, addressing that will help enhance the breeding bird habitat for that type of species. What about this beautiful bird on the left here? Yes? Wood thrush. Awesome, yeah. So wood thrush, folks know where that one nests? This is a little test from those who attended. Mid-story, great. Oh, you're doing great here. We need some badges or something like high five. This is great. So wood thrushes, no, it's great, it's great. So wood thrushes nest in the mid-story, so 6 to sort of 20 feet up, but they feed on soil invertebrates, right? So they're also feeding on the ground. So having this cover, right, and healthy sort of soil community, that can really help our wood thrush. And then what about far right there? I know I'm looking at you because you're just yes, yeah, great. Awesome. So a veery sort of on the far right, a thrush like the wood thrush, but not as distinct pattern, sort of coloring on the breast there. And so the veery, that one nests also on the ground or close to the ground, right? And so we'll see habitat later on this property that is really wonderful I think for veery because it's got it's a wetland. But so these would be the bird species that would be addressed by, would be helped by addressing sort of some of these habitat components. So we also worked with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And we developed a climate adaptation plan with them. And so Jess Weichel, who came to speak a couple weeks ago, she really talked about sort of some of the climate impacts we're seeing and some of the ways that landowners can address this. So, this, I would say dive into that to get the full picture on what are some of the climate changes we're going to see and impacts. But what I'll share here is sort of some of the threats or vulnerabilities that we address that are specific to this property. And one is sort of summer moisture stress. So if you'll remember, we'll have these deluges, right, of flooding, and then we'll have long periods of time without rain, right? And so that we've had, a number of summers where we've been in drought in the state. And that really, impacts sort of trees significantly, and particularly on this property. If you remember that topographic map, here's the ridge, right, that runs down it. And there's pretty thin soils on this ridge, so in particular, this is an area where, I'm concerned that some of these trees are gonna experience over time sort of drought stress. And so that's one thing, to kind of keep in mind. And then when we think about not only sort of existing trees, but also the ability to establish the next generation of trees, that's going to be a limiting factor in terms of soil moisture. And then we kind of couple in sort of competition from native species. Hay-scented fern is native, but it can be competitive and sort of impact the ability of the sort of next forest to establish. So that's kind of one thing to consider. And then, in the most recent decades, deer. Deer love sugar maples and white ash. And so in some areas, some parts of the state, they're really impacting sort of those new seedlings to come up. So that's one thing. I have seen, pretty significant deer browse on this property. So that's another thing to kind of consider as we think about sort of increasing that. And then we've all experienced this greater wind disturbance, greater precipitation events, and that's really going to be something to think about in terms of how do we, manage this forest going forward. And then unfortunately, in that stand wand I showed you on the edge of the field, we have earthworms. And I know that may seem, for folks that are kind of just hearing this, earthworms are great in gardens and agricultural settings, but in the forest, they wreak havoc. And there are 20 species of earthworms that are from Asia and Europe that have been found in Vermont. And they can really change soil structure and chemistry that makes it hard. Some species will consume all the organic matter and humus layer, which is kind of that leaf litter and organic matter right on the forest floor. And a lot of our herbaceous plants and sugar maple rely on that to germinate. And so that can really have impacts. And so I'm seeing a lot of yellow birch in that stand, and that's probably going to be the future species that's able to establish in there sort of in the future. It may not be sugar maple. So again, just something to kind of think about. And then the emerald ash borer was discovered 5 miles as the EAB flies in Bristol in 2019. And I haven't seen any signs and symptoms of EAB yet, but it's something I'm thinking about when we have a lot of ash in certain areas. So I'll talk a little bit more about, one of our goals for conserving ash. So when I was ready to implement our forest management plan, so all those kind of assessments and ideas sort of went into our forest management plan. And then in the winter of 2020 to 2021, we were ready to implement it. And these were some of the goals that came out of that assessment process. We wanted to increase the forest resilience to climate change. And relatedly, one way to do that is to improve our diversity of species and our diversity of ages. And then wanted to enhance wildlife habitat, particularly for the forest birds that we had talked about, initially. Sort of how do we address that? And then protecting soil and water quality as we do it, conserving white ash, and then generating income and managing for high quality saw timber. So those were kind of all of our goals when I kind of jump into this next piece. I wanted you to meet Kyle Pratt because we're certainly, all of this work and our ability to kind of do this work is dependent on forest workers like Kyle Pratt. So he's a logger, he lives in Richmond with his son. And at the time that he was doing this work, he had 2 employees, Tom and Josh. And the main way that they worked is I marked the trees to be removed, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And Kyle and Josh would cut them down with a chainsaw, and then they would use a bulldozer to bring the trees back to the main skid trail that you'll see here. This was one of our main skid trails. And then Kyle used the grapple skidder to bring them back to the landing. And so you'll see it's a grapple skidder. You see the grapple, which is the big hook that basically grabs the bundle of trees and lifts them and then pulls them out to the landing. Kyle was great to work with. Some of the things I was asking is I'll share about later, where he was kind of like, I'm not sure about this, but we had a good relationship and good communication, and I was happy with how everything, came out.
Okay, to ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Why were you selected cutting those trees?
Yeah, I will get there. Yeah, I'm going to get there. Yep. So the question was, why were you selective cutting those trees? So I'm happy to. I will address that. So we'll keep going. Great. So the main techniques we used were removing single trees and small groups of trees. The silvicultural term is called single tree and small group selection. And so by removing single trees, we were trying, or small groups, 2 to 3 trees, we were creating, they would really be sort of small gaps in the canopy that let, not a lot of light to the forest floor. And so that really favored species like sugar maple and beech, those that are what we call shade tolerant, or able to grow sort of in pretty shady conditions. But in this harvest, I also put in 5 larger groups, and those ranged in size from 1/4 of an acre to 3/4 of an acre. And if you'll remember, one of the goals was to increase climate resilience by increasing species and age class diversity. So in those larger gaps, we'll get species that need more sunlight in order to establish and grow. And so species like aspen, white ash, birch. So these species, by creating larger gaps, we're also going to get a diversity of species. So we'll have, the sugar maple and beech sort of in smaller openings, and then sort of in these larger openings. And then that is those new trees, that's the next age class. So that's how in this entry we're increasing our diversity of ages on the property. And this really mimics sort of this single tree small group selection really mimics wind disturbance. So when you get sort of wind damage or a windstorm that comes in, it's going to create these gaps, right? And that's where sort of new trees will establish. And so it's kind of helping us achieve a lot of these goals. So Aldo Leopold said to keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And so one of the sort of missing pieces in our forest is large downed wood, right? And so that's something that in doing this management, I asked the logger Kyle to any really unmerchantable sort of poor quality wood, I was like, it's marked, cut it and just leave it. And so there's sort of an example of that. And that, that's providing great wildlife habitat perching sites for drumming. I know Steve showed a great video of a rough grouse drumming on one of these logs. So rough grouse would hop right up there. Great amphibian, kind of cool, moist places for amphibian, lots of decay organisms as that breaks down, nutrient cycling, right? And then I also asked Kyle to leave, all the tops were left in the woods. And I asked him not to limb them, meaning don't cut them down so they're lower. Leave them intact and messy. And it was something that he was pretty concerned about because of the aesthetics, right? A lot of landowners are very concerned about the aesthetics, and that was really messy looking. And I assured him that this was my decision. Mess is best, right? In this case, because that mess, it's going to take much longer for that to break down if it's left intact. That kind of fine woody material, it's protecting any trees that establish from being browsed by deer, and it's providing great cover and substrate for insects, for birds to sort of glean and find cover underneath. So kind of that was an important piece of this project to have done, to kind of leave those tops intact. And it's helping kind of restore or kind of build these sort of missing pieces. And then, so here's our elder, here's our kind of old tree. These trees, there are some trees that you can tell they were pasture grown because they branch pretty low. So when this was cleared, these were the trees that were left, and they're probably, give or take, about 150 years old. And these are our legacy trees. So these are the trees that will be left to live out their biological lifespans. They will, eventually, pieces may break off. That's going to be great, downed large pieces of wood. They'll eventually can become standing snags, and really it's, their whole life, it doesn't end when they die. They're still contributing huge values even sort of in their death. And so those are the trees that will be left. And I really love, so Jerry Franklin's a forest ecologist and old growth expert, and he described old trees in this way. An old tree is not simply an enlarged version of a young tree, any more than an old person is an enlarged version of a child. An old tree has developed a whole lot of idiosyncratic characteristics over time as a result of opportunities and blows that it has suffered. And an old tree provides absolutely unique attributes. And so for those that have read, I'll kind of try to connect some of the speakers in the series, Ethan's book. He's got, one of my favorite chapters is on the wolf tree. And he really does a great job of describing all these we call them absolutely unique attributes, right, of wolf trees. And so some of those are kind of perch sites, right? That tree is still sequestering a lot of carbon, and it's stored a heck of a lot of carbon over its lifetime. Oftentimes they have cavities. Does anybody subscribe to Mary Holland's blog? Yeah, well, I love the recent one, and just learning that 1 out of every 4 wildlife species in New England rely on cavities, which is cool to think of the role that they really play. And just the bark. I mean, bats can kind of sort of sneak up under there. Mosses, lichens, it's just a great sort of substrate. So there's a whole almost like ecosystem just in sort of these one trees. So important to kind of leave those. So when we have them, we leave them, we protect them. And even honestly, if pieces of them fall on the ground as sort of large material, I mark it off, and they're, you know, I don't want bulldozers or skidders driving over it. We're just going to protect them sort of intact. So that's kind of a thing that, you know, can be done to kind of protect some of these important attributes. And then, given the arrival of the emerald ash borer at VLT, we've really been thinking about how do we conserve ash? How do we leave a future for ash and invest in the future of ash in the state? You'll see here, if anyone knows my colleague, I know Paul, I know you know David McMath, he's about 6'2", and he is standing next to this big ash tree on this property. And so, you know, some of the things that we can do to invest in the future is to not cut all the ash, right? There is no solution yet to the emerald ash borer, but there is known resistance. And so if we cut all the ash, we're not giving that resistance a chance to express itself. So we did harvest some ash in that single tree small group selection approach that I shared about, but I left a lot of healthy ash as well, and that, you know, maybe there will be some resistant ash in that. I also, in those larger openings I talked about, I hope is to regenerate ash in there, and we'll get that next sort of generation established. And then I treated, you'll see it's a tree injection method that will keep those trees alive. I need to inject them every 3 years over the pressure of the emerald ash borer infestation, but they will kill any emerald ash borer that try and feed on that tree. And so that is a goal to kind of keep a naturally reproducing population on the landscape. And VLT is kind of doing that on 10 of our different feedlands and in collaboration with different partners in order to keep genetic diversity intact so that we have sort of this population sort of going forward. And then, yeah.
Just wondering what that injection is.
Yeah, so it's called emamectin benzoate. It's a systemic insecticide. Yep.
Can you say it one more time?
Yeah, emamectin. Oh gosh, E-M-E-C-T, I'll follow up with you after and spell it out, but yeah. Yeah.
What was the second word?
Benzoate.
Benzoate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can spell that for you. Hard to do it, yeah. In front of a group, yeah. Yeah, so that's something that you know, we're also doing as well, investing in. And then this funny acronym here, MAMA plot, managing ash mortality. I also have a plot on this property that's 40 ash trees that I will not cut. I will let them be attacked by the emerald ash borer, and we'll see if any of them have any resistance, because what they've been finding, they call them lingering ash. And these trees may eventually die, but they survive well beyond what all their neighbors sort of, once their neighbors have been attacked and died, they seem to survive, and they have some level, that tree is mounting a successful response to the emerald ash borer. And what they're doing is they're breeding now. They have these orchards where they're breeding, North Carolina, Ohio, they're breeding that resistance sort of into the species. So that's, yeah, pretty exciting. So we're sort of, you know, looking at that too. And so just kind of wrapping up with this case study, you know, I did want to say that we also, you know, money generated from forest management can help offset the costs of land ownership. And it also supports local businesses. And so we had about 110 cords of firewood were sold to a firewood dealer down the road, literally just a mile down the road. We had about 115 cords of pulpwood went to International Paper. A little over 2,000 board feet of veneer saw logs, so like the highest quality saw logs. Those went to Columbia Forest Products in Newport, and then we sold almost 50,000 board feet to a sawmill in Quebec where they'll turn them into lumber. So certainly, you know, we left a lot in the woods, but we also did extract some value and generate some revenue and support sort of the whole forest products chain through this project as well. And then Jess, you know, talked about this a little bit, and she might have named it or not as assisted migration, but there is no red oak on this property yet. But red oak, hickory, some of those species that you're more likely to find in southern New England are better adapted to the future climate conditions, right? And so I have a colleague, Pat Bartlett, who sprouts red oak acorns. And so he gave me 150, and he's down in Woodstock, so they're from a different zone, right? And I planted them in the 2 largest openings. So here's that 3/4 acre opening. So you can see all this sort of wood that was left on site. I did retain a yellow birch in the middle of the opening. Jess talked a little about retention. You'll see a snag. But I planted some of the red oaks. I tried to tuck them underneath some of the larger kind of downwood to kind of protect it. But that's something that, you know, also I did find a couple of them, which is so exciting. They've made it so far. So we'll see. And then, you know, I just want to make this final point about this. There are areas where we're not managing. So Alaire Diamond, our ecologist, who you'll meet in just a second, she identified this black ash red maple seepage swamp. Important for a number of species. This is where we might find Veery being very happy. And, you know, important for amphibians, four-toed salamanders, northern dusky, you might find kind of in this habitat. And this is an area where I can enroll it in current use. It's called an ESTA, ecologically sensitive treatment area. And this is, we don't have to manage for timber in here. But if, you know, some honeysuckle barberry kind of establishes in there, I'll intervene and kind of remove that. But basically, sort of the goals of this area are more for that wetland value. So this is kind of one of those reserves. So I want to move to the Button Farm, and I'm going to have my colleague Alaire Diamond introduce this project for you. And here we go.
Hi, I'm Alaire Diamond, an ecologist with Vermont Land Trust, and I'm here today at the Button Farm in Colchester, Vermont. Vermont Land Trust owns and manages this farm together with Gene Button, whose family has worked this land for over 120 years. We are working on a couple of different ecological restoration projects. Behind me, you see the
All right, hang on. Let me just, for some reason, we hopped off the internet. A little technical difficulty, hang on. Okay, let's see if this, all right, okay, Alaire, go for it.
restoration projects. Behind me, you see the
Oh no. All right, let me try redoing this. Okay, and I apologize, it's gonna give us an ad. All right, hang on.
I know. Here today.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Alaire Diamond, an ecologist with Vermont.
3 times the charm.
And I'm here today at the Button Farm in Colchester, Vermont. Vermont Land Trust owns and manages this farm together with Gene Button, whose family has worked this land for over 120 years. We are working on a couple of different ecological restoration projects. Behind me, you see the small valley of Crooked Creek, which is a small stream that flows north from here. It joins another stream just after it leaves the Button property, and then that stream flows directly into Lake Champlain and now it's staying in Colchester. And about 70 years ago, the late 1940s, early 1950s, a dam was constructed here on Crooked Creek right behind me where these machines are working right now. So what we're doing is we're removing that dam. It was a dam made out of earth, and restoring the natural flow of Crooked Creek. What we want to do now is to continue the reforestation that's happening naturally in the valley, but we're going to be bringing wood to restore some of that natural structure. The wood will also help to maintain the grade of the stream. So in the coming days, the land will continue to be shaped. Those wood pieces will be installed. There will be some other pieces of natural structure, so other pieces of wood, branches, some rocks to create a little bit of microtopography in the wetland, which will provide places for wildlife to perch, for decomposition to happen, for seeds from native plants to alight and grow and germinate. We'll also be planting wetland seeds, some upland seeds, and some plants, including willows, dogwoods, ostrich fern, and a variety of other native wetland plants that would occur naturally in this area. We've learned about what plants that we're going to put in here by studying the area and studying what would grow naturally at this site. It's going to be pretty exciting to see this come back to life as a wetland and stream system for the natural flow of water into Lake Champlain.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alaire. Okay, so we'll go back to here.
When was that video taken?
That was done, gosh, that's a good question. Probably a year or two ago. Yeah.
Still a relatively
It is still a relatively new project, right? Yeah, and so this, oh boy. Well, that's fun. How did I do that? Okay, how do I turn? That's going to be really annoying. Okay, here we go. Okay. Oh, that's a new one. Okay, great. Okay, so this is a relatively new project as well. So this is a picture of the farm in 2021. So you'll see the pond, the farm pond is still there. But just imagine what Alaire had said, and that this whole valley, so basically Crooked Creek, runs through this stand. These are all white pines. Runs through the stand, about a third of a mile, sort of runs through the property there.
And is the dam just on that
The
upper
dam's,
edge of the pond?
yep, you can see it right here. There's the dam, and then you can't see the stream, but it kind of heads down
And that was
that way.
just made to create the pond at
Create the
some
pond.
point.
Yes, yep. So it was constructed in the it was around late 1950s. It was constructed for water for the cattle, for the farm. And then unfortunately what's that?
Sort of conservation.
Oh, yeah, probably funded it. Yeah, sure. Yep. And so the dam was constructed, but then unfortunately the family had to sell the cows in the early 1960s. So it wasn't used for very long. But this all, I don't know if you remember from the video, that whole valley was pasture, was open. And so these trees are actually relatively young. They would have established after that the cows were removed. So they're, kind of 1965, around 1965, 1970 is when they started to grow back. So you can imagine this was all sort of open land. But since then, what we look at here is this is Crooked Creek. So sorry, I keep moving away from the, but so as you can see, this is what we call an incised stream. So it's pretty deep at the banks, and it's really in only high flood events that this stream can access its floodplain. So here's the floodplain of Crooked Creek. So this is a result of sort of over time, this stream, it's dug itself deeper and deeper into the ground.
It's coming out of that pond.
It's coming out of that pond. Yep. So it starts above the property. It comes down through the pond and then exits below the pond, and then joins another tributary and eventually ends up in Lake Champlain. So this is Colchester. The property is pretty close to the lake, sort of as the crow flies. And so this diagram up on the left here, I know it can be a little bit hard to see, but it's basically the evolution of restoring a stream. So Crooked Creek is here up at the top left. So you can see single channel incised stream. And this is where Alaire has us headed, right? Pre-settlement, our streams, and this is influenced by beaver, were really not single straight channels, right? They were braided that would break apart and come together and enter a wetland and then break apart and come together again. And so that's kind of what Alaire is trying to move us towards, with this project. And how they're doing that is she worked with a class at UVM, Beverly Wemple's class, and they installed these structures called beaver analogs. So remember Ethan wanted us to be a beaver? Well, it's happening on the Button Farm. And so what you'll see here is the students at UVM are using, you're gonna love this, buckthorn A lot of buckthorn on the property, and we're doing a lot of introduced weed control on the property. But the buckthorn posts are going to be put into these structures. And so you see here, here's the sort of LiDAR of Crooked Creek. Here's the pond, the dam, here's the stream. And all these X's, these yellow X's, those are these beaver analogs. I'm going to show you a photo of that in a minute. But a lot of them were installed. And so these students helped to develop the design and engineering around where and how many of these structures will be put into the creek.
European buckthorn? You're doing what?
Yeah, so common buckthorn.
Not European.
Common, it's the same. Yeah, I think same thing. Yeah, introduced from. So they're cutting it. So let me show you. That's our next slide. So they're cutting it, right? And they're installing it as posts across the stream, and then they're weaving willows between the posts. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to encourage the stream to kind of slow down and sort of access its floodplain.
Where are you getting the buckthorn
From the property. Unfortunately, it is a Champlain Valley, so we probably have 8 different species of introduced weeds on this property. We're in a 3rd year of doing control, but there's still quite a lot of material out there to use. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of, I think, a beautiful loop to be able to control the buckthorn and use it in a stream restoration, which is great. So here's a picture. So the red circles on the stream here, here, and here, those are where these structures have been installed. This is a group of that sort of buckthorn material that was cut to use in the installation. So what you'll see here, what's really cool, is I don't know if you've noticed, but this was after a big precipitation event. Do you see this ponding? So the stream is going that way. They're already working, right? It's cool. It's causing this ponding, causing the sort of stream to start to access its floodplain, which is really exciting. They also installed these, they're called post-assisted log structures. So these group of sticks are secured to one side of the stream. And what that's doing is it's encouraging the water to meander. It's pushing the water sort of away from that bank where it's going to continue to sort of cut in and pushing it towards the other side. So that's kind of one of the other structures they included. So here's a little bit more. So all that work was done before the dam was removed. So they were kind of getting the stream ready for this next phase of the restoration. And so you'll see here, this is where, Alaire was talking about really the goal being to restore Crooked Creek to a naturally flowing stream valley. And so part of that work was you saw the pile of trees that were uprooted. And what they did is in the stream valley where the pond was, is they crossed them. So here's one root wad, here's another root wad, and they cross them. And that's to really kind of maintain these wooden structures, maintain the grade sort of that valley as it kind of makes its way down to Crooked Creek. And that's, we don't want this sort of stream to kind of incise. And now that we've kind of removed the dam and restored that natural flow, we want to encourage it to meander, right? And we don't want to have sort of this steep grade that will kind of create that incision. So that's kind of the role that those wooden structures play. So that's a lot of partners went into this project, as you can imagine. And so I just wanted to kind of show this slide. But it's something that is kind of with their Alaire's with a group from UVM sort of and other partners monitoring the change over time to see how the stream kind of restores some of those attributes. Yeah.
Will you be planting trees there as well?
So they did a bunch of wetland planting in this area. So brought in turtle heads and sort of native vegetation. And then I think naturally over time, but certainly monitoring for the buckthorn and like all those introduced weeds that they don't kind of establish in there. But this is one, VLT does a lot of partners do a lot of riparian planting along streams. And this one, they haven't done a ton of tree planting in this yet, but certainly have planted some other shrubs and things like that.
How
Yeah.
did the floods affect this property?
Yeah, like the recent ones this past winter, yeah, there's, if you go to VLT's YouTube page, there's some footage of kind of how this kind of area weathered that. And it definitely was helpful to have these structures in place. Yep, and to have this kind of set up and restored before that happened. Yeah, yeah.
Was this the same project she wrote about in Northern Woodlands?
I don't know, maybe, probably. Yeah, she's done a couple of these type of projects. This was probably the sort of biggest one that involved a lot of pieces where she was trying, they call it process-based restoration and storing these beaver analogs. I think this was the first one she did that on, so probably, yeah. So that's another good place you could read more about this, yeah, project. So yeah, so just to kind of summarize kind of our journey. I think we're just starting to see, and you asked about the stream restoration, what are the impacts or results of that project? We're just starting to see, some of the benefits of this work to create more resilient forests, more resilient landscapes. There is funding and support for this type of work for landowners. I know that stream restoration was very complicated and there's a lot of partners, but there is for private landowners the natural, well, it's hard to know what the future will bring, but the Natural Resource Conservation Service provides cost share funding for landowners. And one, they have a number of different practices, but one is strategic woody inputs, which is basically a version of a kind of a little bit of a larger version of the beaver analogs that Alaire had done. I mean, that's something that it's a small enough project that, could, be implemented by a number of different ways, the beaver analog part of it. But there is cost share through NRCS for that. The harvest we had that I talked about, the first project, that was a commercial harvest, so we did generate income with that one, but there's also funding for private landowners for what we call pre-commercial work. So restoration work that can happen, bird habitat work in particular. There's a couple of practices for that that could certainly, myself or folks at Audubon could connect folks with for that. So. And certainly private landowners for working with a forester. Foresters, can certainly help you implement these type of practices on your own property. So, we're using sort of our best available science, but there's, we definitely don't know everything. So we're kind of monitoring, paying attention, trying to see what actions worked well, what didn't, and how do we sort of adapt going forward. So, yeah.
How you think if you want a therapist, you can go and what kind of, I mean, we don't do a bit too much here, but.
No, it's good to go to a therapist. Yeah.
Tell me what kind of things you want them to have. Is there any kind of search tool like that for foresters? Because I'm going to guess, everything you said here, and looking at the number of partners that are involved with any project,
yeah.
It's really hard to have that if you're a landowner with 10 acres or 20 acres.
Right, yep.
Need a full plant. You might want a forester, but not get someone if you're going to have a small, super small property.
Yeah.
But there are different kinds of foresters that are going to encourage or know about the kind of practices that you're sharing.
Yeah.
Is there a way to kind of filter and find things that are...
Yeah, there's not like a match dating site for foresters, unfortunately, but maybe it's a good idea. Maybe there should be. But, I think I encourage landowners to interview, different foresters. You can get a list of licensed foresters in the state. I encourage folks to talk to other landowners, talk to friends and neighbors, to talk about sort of what their forester is. Are they, happy with sort of the work they're doing? And yeah, I know, Paula, did I see your hand go up? Did you have other suggestions there?
Well, yes. First of all, there's different kinds of foresters.
Yeah.
Some of them work for the state.
Yeah.
For example, at the federal government, and their view is going to be different than an industrial forester who works for a lumber company or a paper company or something.
Yeah.
Because they're primarily looking to produce product.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that change the point of view that the forester may have.
Mm-hmm.
And we all sort of follow, like everything, follows public opinion to a certain extent. And I look at the evolution of what's happened you know, just since I've been involved in forestry, which is a relatively short period of time, in life of the forest, but I've watched all these things change. You know, you weren't supposed to drop any trees in a stream because that was going to mess things up. And now we're building dams in the streams with the trees.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
there was a time when we were supposed to be lopping all of our tops, you know, and getting the best utilization we could.
Yeah.
Part of the sustained yield business. And, you know, so there's this constant evolution going on, and we're going back to Mother Nature one step at a time. And at some point, probably we'll all live in teepees and only need poles that are this big to hold them up. I don't know. But it's,
let's hope not. I don't think we're headed in that direction, but things change. So for those online, I'll just kind of maybe summarize what Paul was sharing here. And he was kind of in answer to that question, and I should repeat the question. I'm just remembering, Sean, to repeat that for folks online. Folks were, Sharon was asking, you know, if someone's interested in a forester that's, you know, kind of maybe more ecologically focused, how do you find them? And sort of Paul, in kind of taking that thought, you know, was saying, well, there's different types of foresters. There's foresters that work for timber companies, sort of industrial, foresters that work for companies like Weyerhaeuser, right? There's foresters that work for the state. And so for private landowners, there's consulting foresters, and those are the folks that you can hire to implement these type of practices. And Paul was sort of noting that these are ideas, and what we do sort of has changed over time. And, you know, one example was, you know, we were told, you know, lop all the tops. And we were told, you know, keep wood out of the stream. Now we're adding wood to restore habitat and function. And so, it's trying to find, you know, folks that share your management goals, and we're, you know, working with them. But I think there's no kind of specific, I guess, list. There's different organizations that foresters are members of, the Forest Guild and the Society of American Foresters, and those, you know, organizations differ maybe in their values to a certain degree, and so, you know, there may be a difference in connecting with foresters that are members of those organizations. Yeah, Paul.
It might be good to say that probably the best place to start is your county forester. Because
Great
you're
point.
going to know the range of foresters in their area.
Yep.
And
Great point.
they can say, well, so-and-so is primarily an industrial forester, or so-and-so is a consultant, or if there's specific goals that you're interested in, they may be able to say, well, you know, here's several people who I know are experienced in this. And,
that's
then,
great.
Then go out and, you know, call them. Go out in the woods with them, because what you have to do is feel good about the person that you're asking information of.
Absolutely.
That's very important.
Yeah, that's great. So just for folks online, Paul was suggesting start with your county forester. So these are foresters that work for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. They're not actually on county lines anymore. They're more kind of regional at this point, but that would be a good person to start with. They maintain lists of consulting foresters for private landowners. You know, folks ask VLT foresters, so folks with conservation easements are always asking for recommendations of consulting foresters, and based on their landowner goals, you know, we can, knowing how folks work, we can, you know, suggest folks for them to connect with. Yeah. Right, yeah.
So, my name's Sandal.
Hi, Sandal. Yeah.
And I did a forester dating game. And
oh, nice. It worked for you. Great. Hey, great. Congratulations.
no, anyway, I'm not a forester. I'm a wildlife management major. Is there an elevation limitation to most forestry work in Vermont? I mean, I'm feeling like your Jerusalem skyline is probably reasonable elevation, and that ridge, I don't know what the elevation is, but I just wondered if there's some limitation to how high up forest can be managed?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly restrictions like 2,500 feet. And the Jerusalem skyline property is about, I'm gonna say it's about 1,600, 1,700 feet. So it definitely is kind of higher up in elevation. You know, there's different regulations that sort of may limit forestry operations. There's sort of size of openings, like if someone's creating an opening that's 40 acres or larger, you have to get a heavy cut permit. You know, in terms of elevation, it's kind of that 2,500 foot level is part of that. You know, on properties with conservation easements, we see kind of unique natural communities that can be, you know, at different elevations, but that can also sort of impact, there may be restrictions on sort of work within some of those sort of montane, unique communities, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can go. Of course you can. All right, thank you. I've read over about 5 or 6 different Vermont land trust easements from properties around where I live.
Okay.
Heavy emphasis on maple production.
Hmm.
The boilerplate stuff, the writings that are in there. I
Okay.
don't have a problem with that. My problem is the tubing, the plastic tubing
Uh-huh.
running through the forest is just, that's a hindrance to somebody, maybe deer, moose, stuff like that.
Yeah.
If I got into the Vermont Land Trust, I've been trying to get them to soften up that language so it's not so strong, and maybe start to reduce some of this plastic tubing that's in the forest itself. So that's just something that nags at me. I'm starting to look at the project.
Okay. Yeah.
I've seen it. I've worked in help tubing stuff, not knowing what it's doing to the forest. Now I look back, I says, that's not a good application. But dragging horses and sleds and stuff through, that's a miserable
Yeah.
turnout for the forest too in the spring. So
Yeah.
I don't know which one's
Yeah.
tubing's in. I'm not getting rid of it. But
Yeah.
I just didn't know if I got into the project, is there a way to soften it up to say you can only use so much tubing or restricted areas? Because it's very, very heavily weighted to maple sugar production in the writing for the Vermont Land Trust.
Yeah, well, I guess so for those online, this gentleman has looked at a couple of conservation easements that the Vermont Land Trust holds and, you know, has made an observation that the language is heavy on sugaring and is concerned about sort of tubing and sort of impacts and in the forest on that. So I guess what I would say is sort of the conservation easement, I'll sort of go back to the purpose of the conservation easement. It's to limit residential, commercial, and industrial development. It does allow management, sort of, and it sets some sidebars, but it doesn't, unlike the current use program, it doesn't actually require anybody to manage, either for sap or for timber or for any of that. But what it does require, if they are going to manage their forest, that they have a forest management plan that's approved by a forester. So I guess, you know, in thinking about our easements, and each easement is unique, so, you know, I'm not aware of what specific easements you were looking at, but I know what it says is it outlines in our permitted usage section, it outlines what the landowner is permitted, what rights do they retain, right? And they do retain the right to harvest sap, they do retain the right to harvest timber. And so, you know, I'm not aware of our easements emphasizing one thing over the other, because our easements are calling for a balance, right? It's a balance of forestry values, scenic values, wildlife values, right? That's kind of what the balance is looking for. And yeah, I mean, I know you're not alone in not being happy with, you know, tubing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
plastic, but
Yeah.
I know that's not forever either too. That maybe a new technology will come.
Sure, yeah, and I know for sure, and for, you know, folks to make a living in sort of commercial sugaring, it's, you know, kind of relying on the tubing is really the kind of only way to kind of balance that. So, yeah, yep, yeah. So thanks for, yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
Okay,
All in all.
Yeah, yeah.
okay. I loved seeing how they're trying to make a stream go back to like native
Yeah.
stream. I'm sure many people here have, and if you haven't, you gotta read Beaverland.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know that book?
I hear you.
By Layla Phillips, Beaverland, by Layla Phillips. She's got a chapter on before the fur trade in colonial time, colonial America, what the streams and rivers looked like.
Mhm.
They were so intricate. They weren't channels, okay? And this is one reason why we have so much trouble with flooding,
Mhm.
because we use this channeling. They were rivers, and we're all too familiar with it. I was flooded out of my apartment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, I was right on a cliff. And
Oh,
I
but
knew when I
still.
moved in, I went, you gotta realize, in a really bad situation, this could flood.
Yeah.
And it did on me. I was taking a chance, but it's a channel, right? A lot of it's a channels in East Montpelier. And I know they're bringing beavers to areas to try to, beavers do incredible things to wetlands next to rivers. They make them, they make pools, they dam it out all different ways. It's amazing.
Mm.
And if you want to read that book, it goes into that whole what they look like. And it's an amazing book because it's the history of beavers, even from, I mean, she's talking about the giant beaver which lived, what is it? I always get the ears mixed up, the Pleistocene.
That sounds
But
right.
she goes into that, and she goes into how this country really economically started on beaver trade. People don't realize how much we owe beavers, you know, but that practically worked them out.
Yeah.
Literally, you know, they come back with protection. But I wish more rivers and streams would go back to that, because it's really what, it's more healthy for all the animals and people too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
Awesome.
read the book if you haven't.
No.
It's
Yeah.
Beaverland.
Thank you. Yeah. So for those that are tuning in online,
Second time, and it's even better. It's such a great book.
I will share this recommendation. I second it. It's a great book, a book called Beaverland, which talks a lot about the history of beaver, the history of the fur trade, and sort of shares this concept that I shared from Alaire's slide that shows, you know, our pre-settlement rivers look very different. And so, yeah, big recommendation for that book to learn more about that. And actually, Layla Phillips came up, Alaire brought her up here. She spoke in Shelburne about a year or two ago. Yeah, there's a recording of her talk online if you want to see that. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, hey Sean.
While we're on the subject, last year we had Ben Goldfarb, who's the author of Eager, who's kind of on the other side of the same coin as Beaverland, to a talk for us. So if you want to check that out,
It's called Eager.
Cool.
Eager is the name of his book, and it's similar themes and really a lot of the themes. So if you've read Beaverland, check out that one too.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you go check out the recording of that presentation.
Yes,
Here.
perfect. Okay, so for those online, if you couldn't hear Sean,
I have my mic on.
oh, you do. Perfect. Okay, good. I didn't know. Great. Yeah. Any other Sandal?
I have one more sort of step back, turn to VLT role. We're hearing a lot from the governor about the necessity for housing. Thousands and thousands of units are needed. You know, and in my head, I'm just saying sort of where, what might it look like, who's looking at the big picture. I mean, when you showed the map of, you know, this, there weren't a whole lot of houses in that Jerusalem area.
Oh, yeah,
You know,
sure.
Starksborough's
Sure,
tucked
yeah.
down there with a few little, you know, roads and stuff like that. I was studying the map.
Yeah.
But,
So we'll go
you know,
back to
I'm
that.
just thinking about, are there also conservation organizations who are touching base with the governor and that new housing initiative, which has a name, but I can't recall it. There's a new, let's
Yeah.
build more housing, I think it's something like that.
Yep.
You know, and just thinking about, you know, I think I did hear somebody making some reference to European house planning design, you know, how to build new communities so that they're still kind of, they function well, and yet they leave forest land, farmland, you know, pretty much intact. I just didn't know if anybody, the land trust is you know, connecting with the governor on that.
Yeah. So the VLT is part of the Vermont Housing and Conservation Coalition, and is also partners. It's called the Forest Partnership. So a number of different organizations: VLT, the Nature Conservancy, Vermont VNRC, Vermont Natural Resources Council, Audubon Vermont. And I know Vermont Housing and Conservation Board is part of that Vermont Housing and Conservation Coalition. So they're certainly working sort of with the legislators and governor to, you know, think through that. I'm not directly involved with that, so I can't give you any sort of specifics of how, but I know they are, and I'd be happy to, touch base with our leadership team, members that are sort of part of that for more specifics. But I know that they've been working through that coalition to think on that. And it happens at all levels, right? Like municipal government all the way sort of up. So yeah, important.
We're running out of time, so I have a couple of questions, but I want to invite anybody else who has a concise question to go for it.
Yeah, hi.
This is maybe a chicken or the egg kind of question. So you mentioned these are both, you know, learning labs, the case studies. Does VLT, go out looking for these kinds of lands to manage, or is it more when a land is conserved, then there's this kind of plan that forms around a particular scenario?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say for lands we own, it's typically been lands that have been gifted to us. We haven't sort of been in a place to sort of proactively manage lands for this type of work, but we do have, I'll say that with a caveat, in that farms, right, we do proactively conserve through our farmland access program. A little different, but on those we were also looking for sort of restoration opportunities as well. For properties that are conserved, right now, really, so many folks are interested in conserving their property that we're not sort of the alternative that you were talking about, sort of proactively going out and identifying sort of properties to conserve or do this type of work on. We're not really at that level, but I would say there's so many sort of opportunities for conservation, and then within all of these properties, there's a lot of great restoration potential as well. And so, our fee lands are the lands where we kind of have the most sort of control on looking at identifying sort of restoration and ecological management opportunities. But then certainly as lands are conserved, and even lands that have been conserved for a while now, we're going back and with funding through the state are able to put river corridor easements on them and think about restoring sort of riparian buffers. So a lot of tree planting, that sort of thing is also happening sort of on those properties. So yeah, so there's a lot of opportunities on sort of existing, and then what properties folks are interested in, conserving at this point. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How often do you have to go back to a property and do a reevaluation and come in with the heavy equipment and do major work on it, and how much is just sort of checking it now and then?
Yeah. I mean, so current use requires a management plan update every 10 years. So that's kind of like a nice interval, right, to see how the foresters responded over those years. And really, the entry of doing management activities is so like property specific. There may be some properties that it's either sort of young forest, and so it just has a while to go to properties that are really recovering from poor management or some issues that are just, there's not a lot necessarily that needs to be done right away. So it really is pretty specific. For the property, the Jerusalem Skyline property that I talked about, typically we're managing that for what's called uneven age management. So that means we're trying to establish multiple ages of trees, multiple cohorts or age classes of trees over time. And typically the interval between harvests for that type of management is every 15 to 20-ish years, right? And so we won't go back to Jerusalem Skyline for that type of project for another 15 to 20 years. But, some of these stream restoration projects and that, I mean, that's all kind of sort of what needs to be done sort of now. And so, I think once Alair does that sort of monitoring and seeing what's needed, is there any other work that's needed? I know there was a little bit of, so what we didn't talk about is above that dam, there was a culvert, and that's how the stream entered the pond. And so that culvert had to be resized, it had to be made bigger. But after they did that, there was a little bit of erosion that needed to be addressed to kind of stabilize that, so it can continue, because there was a farm road that is used to access the property. So yeah, it kind of depends sort of on the project and sort of how often you go in there. But typically, we're monitoring properties for easements every year. On these properties we own, I'm out there multiple times a year, so yeah, it kind of depends, but yeah.
Well, I think we'll wrap things up there. If folks have any other questions that come up, feel free to come up and hang out and chat a little bit. But thanks everybody for coming out, and thanks very much to Caitlin.
Thanks, John. Yeah, thanks everyone. Great.